On the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem and overlooking the Temple Mount, sits the grave of Menachem Begin. The former prime minister had requested not to be buried with many of Israel's statesmen on Mount Herzl, but rather among his brethren who over the centuries had asked to be interred near Judaism's most sacred site. But Begin's grave is not only a testament to tradition, it hints to us that he well understood all that occurred right here in the last Passover observed in the temple, and that the lessons that he learned saved modern Israel in its infancy. The Jewish revolt against Rome began in 66 CE and ended with the destruction of the Mikdash, the temple, on the 9th of Av in the year 70, or alternatively with the fall of Masada in the year 74. As bloody as the battle with Rome may have been, Jerusalem was also torn from within during this period by battles among the Jews themselves. Incredibly, all the while that they were battling Rome, the Jews were also fighting with each other. The city was divided into three very anti-Roman forces, led by Jewish leaders who hated each other even more. One faction, led by Shimon bar Giora, held much of Jerusalem, west and south of the mount. Yochanan of Gush Chalav held the outer region of the Temple Mount, and Elazar bar Shimon oversaw the inner Mikdash. These Jewish troops, utilizing catapults and weaponry that they had captured from the Romans, were shooting at each other. Picture this, if you will. Every day, the daily temple service is ongoing. Sacrifices are offered on the altar that, as we have argued in our lectures, is meant to embody Jewish togetherness. And meanwhile, arrows are flying, catapults are firing, Jews are shooting at Jews, the blood of Jews in the temple mixing with the blood offered on the altar. We have met the enemy, and it is us. Meanwhile, their true enemy, the Romans surrounding the city, could not believe their good fortune. According to Josephus, Vespasian, the general overseeing the assault, initially refrained from launching the final attack on Jerusalem because he believed, correctly, that his work was being done for him by the Jews themselves. The Jews, he said, were killing each other. As Josephus writes, Vespasian said, "It is their best way while their enemies are destroying each other with their own hands to sit still as spectators." In December of the year 69, Vespasian was proclaimed emperor, and he placed the battle against Jerusalem in the hands of his son, Titus. Titus prepared to lay final siege to Jerusalem, as Jews in the year 70 were streaming from all over the world into Jerusalem for what was the most important holiday of the year, Passover. But how does one bring the Paschal sacrifice when the temple complex itself is divided? As a seeming show of goodwill, Elazar bar Shimon, whose forces were occupying the Azarah, the courtyard where the Paschal sacrifice must be offered, agreed to allow those members of the rival factions to enter the inner sanctum and offer the sacrifice. His enemy, Yochanan of Gush Chalav, who was on the Temple Mount, used that opportunity on Pesach, on Passover, to seize the Mikdash and kill his rivals holding the inner courtyard. Thus, the last Passover in the Beit HaMikdash in the temple was spent by Jews attacking and killing Jews in the most sacred of sites. And rather than the blood of the Paschal lamb being sprinkled on the altar, the Mizbeach was instead spattered with the blood of Jews themselves. The irony is thereby terribly profound. These warring factions fought in what should be the locus of Jewish covenantal unity, and they did so while purportedly seeking to fulfill the one commandment that perhaps more than any other, the Paschal sacrifice, is meant to bring about covenantal unity. For rightly understood, the Paschal lamb, the Korban Pesach, is not only spiritual in symbolism, but political. Unlike other sacrifices, it was brought not by individuals, but groups who ate the sacrifice at the Seder together as a symbol of their covenantal union. From its origins in Egypt, The Paschal Lamb was meant to embody not only Jewish freedom, but Jewish unity. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik put it this way, quote, "Only a free and proud people think of others and share with others. The birth of the Chesed community, of a nation within which people unite, give things away, care for each other, share what they possess, is symbolized by the Paschal sacrifice. God," Rabbi Soloveitchik said, "did not need the Paschal Lamb. He had no interest in the sacrifice. He simply wanted the people, slaves who had just come out of the house of bondage, to emerge from their isolation and insane self-centeredness into the Chesed community. A new fellowship was formed around the Paschal Lamb," Rabbi Soloveitchik concluded. "A new community sprang into existence. Being together, living with each other, sharing something many possess in common, was made possible by the ceremonial of the Paschal Lamb." End quote. Meanwhile, having spent the time set aside for the Paschal offering by focusing instead on slaughtering each other, the leaders of the factions suddenly noticed that Titus was setting up a siege. Indeed, scholars suggest that Titus had specifically waited for Passover in order to prepare for the final besieging of Jerusalem, the final attack on the city, because the general knew that so many Jews would be entering in the days before. The city fell, in truth, because so many were within it at the time, because the multitudes that had arrived there found suddenly that they had nothing to eat, because in the weeks leading up to Passover 70 CE, the rival factions, seething with hatred for one another, had done the unthinkable. They had set fire to each other's storages of food. Finally, having spent the beginning of the holiday focusing on attacking one another, the Jews in Jerusalem were suddenly coming to the realization that now Passover had brought in so many more people and there was nothing to eat. Thus, Josephus writes of Yochanan of Gush Chalav, quote, "To which other parts of the city he turned, he never failed to set fire to the homes that were stocked with grain and supplies of every kind. When he withdrew, Simon advanced and followed his example. It was," Josephus writes, "as if to oblige the Romans, they were destroying all that the city had laid up against a siege and hamstringing their own powers. The result," Josephus concluded, "the result at any rate, was that almost all the grain, enough to support them through many years of siege, went up in flames. It was hunger," Josephus argues, "hunger that defeated them, a thing that could never have happened if they had not brought it about themselves." Meaning, the enormous amount of Passover celebrants in the city ensured the famine and therefore the city's doom. The walls of Jerusalem were breached on 17 Tammuz, and Josephus describes what happened 3 weeks after that, in the very courtyard where only several months before multitudes of Israelites had streamed in, intending to celebrate Passover. Quote, "As the legions charged in, neither persuasion nor threat could check their impetuosity. Passion alone was in command. Round the altar, the heaps of corpses grew higher and higher, while down the sanctuary steps poured a river of blood, and the bodies of those killed at the top slithered to the bottom." End quote. Thus the Mizbeach, the altar, on the 9th of Av, was stained with Jewish blood, just as it had been stained with that very same Jewish blood on Passover itself. Only now it was the Romans causing the bleeding. We are now able to understand, ladies and gentlemen, the significance of a fascinating fact about the Jewish calendar that is emphasized in Jewish legal texts. And that is that the 15th of Nisan, when Pesach is celebrated, and the 9th of Av, when the loss of the temple is mourned, always come out on the same day of the week each year, establishing thereby a link between the two. According to some halachic authorities, this is why the egg has come to take a place of honor on the Seder place itself. The egg is a traditional Jewish food of mourning. eaten immediately after a burial and right before the 9th of Av. It may seem strange that a traditional 9th of Av food suddenly appears on the celebratory Passover plate. But now we are able to understand that Pesach and the 9th of Av are linked. It need not seem so strange. Because of Pesach, Tisha B'Av occurred. Because all those gathered on the last Pesach in the temple showed externally that the message of the Paschal Lamb had not been internalized at all. That is why 70 CE was the last year in which Pesach occurred in the temple. It's not just that Passover was the last holiday observed within the Mikdash before its destruction. The final siege began on Pesach, and the violence in the Mikdash on Passover, Jews killing Jews on the holiday of the formation of a nation. This is what led straight to all that occurred on the 9th of Av. The 2 days are interconnected historically. The reason that we cannot mark Pesach in the Mikdash today is because of what occurred on the last Pesach in 70 CE. And that is why even in our moment of greatest joy every year, we are supposed to be haunted just a little bit by all that occurred here as we sit down at our Seder. Pesach, as a holiday, is meant to embody the unity of Jews joined eating a Paschal sacrifice together. And instead, leading up to that final Passover in the temple, Jews burned each other's stores of food, and then, precisely because there were so many Jews who had entered Jerusalem right before the siege to celebrate Pesach, to celebrate the festival of Jewish unity, only to be besieged without food, therefore Jerusalem fell to hunger. Pesach and the 9th of Av are linked calendrically because Pesach on 70 CE led directly to the 9th of Av, 70 CE. Dr. Lawrence Schiffman once put it this way, quote, Pesach played a role in the final defeat of the Jews and the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash in 70 CE. And he adds that, quote, Josephus tells us that during the Roman siege of Jerusalem, 97,000 people were taken captive and 1,100,000 were killed. He explains his large number is resulting from the fact that the final assault took place around the time of Pesach, when so many Jews were present and were suddenly caught in the clasp of the Roman army. The final siege, Dr. Schiffman writes, did indeed last from sometime in April through August, ending on Tisha B'Av. Pesach, he writes, was the last festival observed in the second Beis HaMikdash, the second temple. Our reflections thus allow us to discover new meaning in the precise phrasing of the opening of the Magid portion of the Haggadah, the centerpiece of the Seder story. We read a stanza that is said by Jews century after century in Aramaic that was clearly added after Jerusalem fell. Halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction. All who are hungry, come and eat. All who need Passover, please participate. Now we are here. Next year, may we be in the Holy Land. Now we are slaves. Next year, we will hopefully be free. Knowing the link between Pesach and the 9th of Av, knowing the failure to appreciate the lesson of Pesach, led ultimately to the 9th of Av, comprehending the connection between the civil war and enforced hunger and the ultimate destruction, knowing, as Josephus wrote, that it was ultimately hunger that defeated them, a hunger that the Jews brought upon themselves. Knowing all this, can it be any surprise that this stanza was added to the Haggadah after Jerusalem fell? What it is saying is extraordinary. A Jerusalem that fell because of hatred of brothers can only be restored through kinship of brothers. A people that fell apart because its members caused hunger to be felt by one another can only be made whole if now we take away the hunger of one another. A paschal sacrifice that was lost because Jews failed to appreciate the unity that the sacrifice itself embodied can only be regained if Jews embody and reflect that unity. Halach ma'anya, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik wrote, quote, is the renewal of a pledge of solidarity among the Jewish people. Solidarity between individual and between individual and the Jewish community as a whole. It is a proclamation that we are one people and that we are ready to help one another, end quote. Thus, this passage, halach ma'anya, I would suggest, was added to the Haggadah after the destruction in order to seek to rectify the past. Pesach of 70 CE was a trauma that would haunt and inform all of the Pesachs that would follow. But here, ladies and gentlemen, is what happened next. Jews everywhere, shorn of the Paschal sacrifice, began the Seder with an expression of all that the sacrifice embodies, halach ma'anya. And having lost Jerusalem, they concluded the Seder by yearning for its restoration. L'shana haba'ah b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And almost 2,000 years after the temple burned, Jews established independence. And 2 months after the rise of the State of Israel, one Jew prevented civil war from occurring again. One Jew remembered the lessons of Pesach 70 CE. He knew what ended the Second Jewish Commonwealth, and he ensured that it did not end the Third when it was still in its infancy. On June 20th, 1948, the ship named Altalena, under the control of Menachem Begin's organization, the Irgun, came ashore at Kfar Vitkin with badly needed arms and ammunition for the fledgling Jewish state. A disagreement ensued between Begin and Israel's leader, David Ben-Gurion, as to the allocation of the arms on the Altalena. Ben-Gurion ordered the Israeli Defense Forces to surround the ship. A boy on the beach, there to assist in the unloading of the ship's cargo, fretted that those coming ashore might be fired upon. Menachem Begin assured this boy that this was inconceivable. Whatever might happen, he said, Jews do not shoot at Jews. He was badly mistaken. A firefight did break out, and the Altalena fled back to the Mediterranean, landing near what is now Tel Aviv's Frishman Beach on June 22nd, with Begin on board. Ben-Gurion ordered the ship shelled. 16 members of the Irgun were killed. Standing on the ship while being fired upon, with dear friends of his dying, Menachem Begin ordered those aboard the Altalena not to fire back, declaring, Milchemet Achim Le'olam Lo, never a war between brothers. After leaving the smoldering Altalena with much of its arms lost forever, Begin went on the radio and again ordered his followers not to seek revenge. After wrongly predicting that Jews would never shoot at Jews, Begin now enunciated an even more extraordinary principle: that Jews should not shoot at Jews even when other Jews were shooting at them. This was Menachem Begin's greatest moment for all his future achievements. The survival of the newly born state was anything other than assured, and shooting back, however justified that self-defense might have been, would have torn the people apart. In his memoir, The Prime Minister, Yehuda Avner quotes Begin explaining his motivation. 20 centuries ago, we faced the bitter experience of the destruction of our Second Temple, the destruction of our capital, Jerusalem. And why? Because of our senseless hatred of each other, a hatred that led to civil war, and to our utter ruin. Bechiyah l'dorot, a weeping for generations, end quote. This time, thanks to Begin, civil war did not take place, though it so easily could have. And we must ponder, how did they find the emotional strength not to shoot back at those shooting at them? In his memoir, The Revolt, Begin describes what had occurred several years earlier, in 1944, during the period known as the Saison, when the Haganah collaborated with the British in helping to arrest members of the Irgun. Begin similarly ordered his followers not to seek revenge, and he wrote in his memoir, why? Quote, strange as it may seem, for we are speaking of Irgun fighters, the decision not to retaliate, which ran counter to the very spirit of natural resistance, was honored by all of them. They were moved by faith, he writes, a profound faith that believed the day was not far distant when all the armed camps in Israel would stand and fight shoulder to shoulder against the oppressor. We dared not destroy our faith by opening a bloody abyss between those who were still brothers. Writes Begin further, we saw our people in Europe in the endless procession of death. We saw the ghettos going up in flames. We saw the oppressor plotting against us all. And from down the corridors of Jewish history, we heard the echo of those other wars, the cursed internecine wars in dying Jerusalem 19 centuries before. Not logic, but instinct said imperatively, no, not civil war, not at any price. A human order, writes Begin, would have been of no avail here. The order came from somewhere, from the depths of Jewish history, and it was obeyed, end quote. The members of the Irgun on the Altalena heard, in other words, the call that came from this site, from Pesach 70 CE. The call for Jewish unity comes from Jewish history itself and from the temple itself. And today it calls out to us from the grave of a Jewish leader on the Mount of Olives, whose love for the Jewish people defined his life. Once, in 1948, civil war was averted when Jews heeded his call. And then the state of Israel truly came into being. And now, if Jews can continue to hear Begin's voice, then Israel can become all it is destined to be.